What would you do if your mother, your sister, your neighbor suddenly began dancing in the street and couldn't stop? Not dancing in joy, dancing in agony, dancing until their feet bled, until they collapsed from exhaustion, until their hearts gave out. And what if, when you tried to help them, when you begged them to stop, they looked at you with eyes filled with terror and kept dancing? Welcome to this journey into one of history's most disturbing and unexplained mass phenomena. But before we descend into the streets of medieval Strasbourg, I need you to ask yourself, where is the line between disease and curse? Between medical crisis and divine punishment? Tell us where you're watching from right now and whether you believe the mind can override the body's most fundamental survival instincts, because by the end of this account, you may question everything you thought you knew about the relationship between psychology, physiology, and the terrifying power of collective belief. This episode discusses real historical events involving mass death, suffering, and psychological trauma. We present these accounts with profound respect for those who suffered and died. This is not entertainment. This is testimony. If you're sensitive to discussions of death, mass hysteria, or psychological distress, please care for yourself first. In the city archives of Strasbourg, France, there exists a physician's journal from 1518 with entries that shouldn't be possible. Detailed observations of patients who danced continuously for days, for weeks, who begged for help even as their bodies refused to stop moving, whose feet left bloody footprints on cobblestones, who danced until their hearts simply stopped. The physician, a man named Paracelsus, wrote one sentence that has haunted medical historians for 5 centuries. They danced as if possessed by demons, but the demons were of their own making. We're about to delve into a mystery that has never been adequately explained, where a single woman's compulsion triggered a plague of movement that consumed an entire city, leaving dozens dead and hundreds scarred forever. This isn't just a story about the past. This is a question about the fragility of the mind, the contagion of fear, and the moment when reality itself seems to shatter. It was the summer of 1518. The Holy Roman Empire was fracturing under religious upheaval. The Protestant Reformation was tearing communities apart, and in the German-speaking city of Strasbourg, now part of France, but then a free imperial city, a series of failed harvests had left the population desperate, starving, and convinced that God had abandoned them. But in July of that year, something began that would prove far more terrifying than hunger. A phenomenon that would force witnesses to question whether they were seeing disease, possession, or the unraveling of reality itself. The air in Strasbourg that summer carried the weight of rot. Not just the rot of spoiled grain in empty storehouses, though that was certainly present. Not just the rot of bodies in the streets, victims of famine, and the sweating sickness that had killed thousands the previous winter. This was something else, something the citizens couldn't name but could feel pressing against their skin like humidity before a storm. The city felt wrong. That's what witnesses would say later, when they tried to explain how it started. The city felt wrong, as if the very stones were holding their breath. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city balanced on the edge of a blade. 40,000 souls crammed within medieval walls, living in a world where the old certainties were crumbling. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, nailed to a church door just months before, had sent shockwaves through the Catholic world. Neighbors who had worshipped together for generations now eyed each other with suspicion, wondering who secretly harbored Protestant sympathies, who might be damned for their beliefs. The price of bread had tripled. Children were dying of starvation in the streets. And in the midst of this crisis, the Church offered only judgment, declaring that God was punishing the city for its sins. The city itself was a labyrinth of narrow streets that twisted between half-timbered houses leaning so close together that neighbors could touch hands across the gaps. Sunlight rarely penetrated to the cobblestones below, leaving the streets in a perpetual twilight that smelled of sewage, rotting vegetables, and desperation. The great cathedral loomed over everything, its spire reaching toward heaven like an accusatory finger, reminding the citizens constantly of their unworthiness. In this city of shadows and hunger, people were already seeing signs and portents everywhere: a blood, red moon, a two-headed calf born in a stable, a woman who claimed to have seen the Virgin Mary weeping in the market square. The boundary between the natural and supernatural had grown thin, worn through by fear and starvation, and the terrible uncertainty of whether tomorrow would bring salvation or damnation. It was into this powder keg of collective anxiety that Frau Trophia stepped on a Tuesday morning in July. Her name was recorded in the city records as Frau Trophia, Frau meaning simply Mrs. Her first name lost to history like so many women of her era. We know she lived on a street near the cathedral. We know her husband was a baker, though with grains so scarce, there was little left to bake. We know she was somewhere in her 30s, an age when women of that time were considered middle-aged, worn down by childbirth and labor, and the simple brutality of staying alive. What we don't know is what she was thinking when she walked out of her house that July morning and began to dance. The first witnesses reported it began around 9 in the morning. Frau Trophia emerged from her doorway and, in the middle of the narrow street, began to move. Not the stately movements of a courtly dance, not the rustic joy of a harvest celebration. This was something else entirely. Her arms lifted of their own accord, jerking and twisting in patterns that seemed to have no relationship to any music, because there was no music. Her feet began to move, shuffling at first, then stamping, then spinning in frantic circles that left her skirts whirling around her legs. Her head lolled back, and witnesses would later report that her eyes were open but unseeing, focused on something beyond the physical world. And she couldn't stop. Neighbors gathered, at first amused. Surely this was some strange jest, some performance meant to lift spirits in these dark times. They called out to her, made jokes. One man clapped a rhythm, thinking she was dancing for entertainment, and had simply forgotten the music. But Frau Trophia didn't acknowledge them. Her feet kept moving, kept stamping against the cobblestones with increasing violence. 1 hour became 2. The amusement curdled into concern. Women approached her, tried to take her arms, tried to guide her back to her house. But her strength was impossible to overcome. She shook them off with movements so violent that one woman was knocked to the ground. Her husband emerged from their home, his face white with confusion and fear. He stood in front of her, blocking her path, begging her to stop. She danced around him as if he were simply another obstacle, her feet never ceasing their terrible rhythm. By noon, her shoes had worn through. Blood began to seep through the leather, leaving dark stains on the street. Still she danced. The crowd grew larger. Word spread through the narrow streets. Frau Trophia had gone mad, was dancing in the street, couldn't stop. People came to see the spectacle, this woman spinning and leaping and stamping with a force that seemed impossible for someone her size. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Sweat poured down her face, soaking her dress. Her movements became more violent, more desperate, as if she were trying to shake something off, trying to escape from her own body. By evening, the city magistrates had been summoned. They stood in a circle around her, watching this impossible thing, trying to apply reason to something that defied all reason. One suggested she was drunk, but no amount of wine could sustain this. Another suggested possession, but the priests who examined her found no signs of demonic influence, or at least none they could name. A physician checked her pulse and found it racing, found her skin burning with fever, found her feet torn and bleeding. But he had no treatment for a disease that made people dance. As darkness fell, torches were lit, and still Frau Trophia danced. Her movements had become mechanical now, repetitive, as if her body had learned the pattern and would simply continue it forever. Her face showed no expression, not joy, not fear, just a terrible blankness. Witnesses would later say she looked like a puppet with its strings being pulled by invisible hands. Her husband brought her water. She drank without stopping the movement of her feet. They brought her bread. She ate mechanically, still dancing, crumbs falling from her mouth as her body jerked and spun. The crowd that had gathered hundreds now, packed into the narrow street, fell silent. This wasn't entertainment. This wasn't madness. This was something else, something that made the hair rise on the backs of their necks and made them want to look away, but found they couldn't. Because deep down, in a place they didn't want to acknowledge, they recognized something in Frau Trophia's dance. They recognized the edge of control she had fallen over, and they understood, though they couldn't have articulated it, that the edge was closer than any of them wanted to admit. One day became two. Frau Trophia danced through the first night, through the second day, through the second night. They tried to restrain her, strong men holding her arms while she screamed and thrashed with supernatural strength. The moment they released her, her feet began moving again, as if they had a will independent of her mind. She slept standing up, her eyes closing for moments before snapping open again, her feet never stopping their rhythm. By the third day, she had been joined. A woman named Frau Neustadt began dancing in the market square. Then another woman near the cathedral, then a man in the street of the butchers. One by one, seemingly at random, citizens of Strasbourg would be struck by the compulsion. They would be walking, working, talking, and then their bodies would begin to move, their feet would start tapping, their arms would begin to sway, and then, before they even understood what was happening, they were dancing. And they couldn't stop. Within a week, 34 people were dancing in the streets of Strasbourg. Within 2 weeks, the number had swelled past 100. By the end of July, witnesses reported that approximately 400 people were caught in the grip of the dancing plague. But this is where the story takes its first dark turn, because the response of the authorities would prove far more disturbing than the plague itself. The city council of Strasbourg, faced with a crisis they couldn't comprehend, consulted with physicians and priests. The physicians, trained in the humoral theory that dominated medieval medicine, concluded that the dancing was caused by hot blood, an excess of heat in the body that could only be released through movement. Their prescription was chilling in its logic. The dancers should be encouraged to dance more, to dance until the heat was expelled from their bodies. The priests, meanwhile, saw divine punishment. God was angry at Strasbourg for its sins, for the Protestant sympathies that had taken root, for the greed and gluttony that had preceded the famine, for the general wickedness that seemed to permeate every corner of the city. The dancing, they proclaimed, was Saint Vitus's curse, sent to punish the unrighteous. And so the city made a decision that would haunt it for centuries. They decided to cure the dancers by making them dance more. Guild halls were opened. A wooden stage was constructed in the grain market. Professional musicians were hired, lute players, pipe players, drummers, and ordered to play continuously. The belief was simple. If the dancers could dance to proper music, in a proper setting, the curse would break. The bad humors would be expelled. Saint Vitus would be appeased. Instead, they created hell. Imagine, if you can, what it must have been like to walk through Strasbourg in August of 1518. The sound reaches you first, the relentless pounding of drums, the shriek of pipes, the discordant wail of instruments played by exhausted musicians who were themselves forced to continue, shift after shift, day after day. The music never stopped. It couldn't stop because the dancers couldn't stop. You turn a corner and see them. Hundreds of people moving in the Guildhall, on the stage, in the streets. Their movements are no longer human. They jerk and spin like marionettes, controlled by a mad puppeteer. Their faces are masks of agony. Many are crying as they dance, tears streaming down their faces, their mouths forming words that might be prayers or might be screams. But the music is too loud to hear. The smell hits you next, sweat and blood and human waste, because the dancers cannot stop to relieve themselves. Some have soiled their clothing as they move. Others have vomited and continue dancing through it. The wooden stage is slick with blood from feet that have danced through skin, through flesh, down to bone. You see a woman, perhaps 30 years old, perhaps younger, it's impossible to tell any more. Her hair has come loose from its covering and hangs in sweat, soaked tangles around her face. Her dress is torn, revealing legs that are nothing but raw wounds from hip to ankle. She is trying to mouth something to you, trying to communicate, but her body won't obey. Her feet keep moving in that terrible, repetitive pattern. Her eyes are desperate, pleading, and then you realize she's begging you to kill her. The physicians walked among the dancers, taking notes, attempting diagnosis. One doctor, whose journal survived, wrote detailed observations that read like dispatches from a nightmare. He noted that the dancers seemed unable to hear or respond to their names. He observed that many appeared to be in a trance state, their eyes unfocused, their consciousness seemingly elsewhere. He documented the injuries. Feet danced down to bloody stumps, legs covered in bruises from collision with walls and other dancers, faces gaunt from exhaustion and dehydration. But what disturbed him most, what he returned to again and again in his journal, was the pattern. The dancers all moved in similar ways. They lifted their arms to similar heights. They spun in similar directions. It was as if, he wrote, they were all following choreography to a song only they could hear. A song that came from somewhere deep and primal and utterly beyond reason. The deaths began in the second week. The first to die was a man named Klaus Whitman, a carpenter who had joined the dancing on the 5th day. He collapsed mid-spin, his heart simply stopping after 6 days of continuous movement. They carried his body from the Guildhall, and another dancer immediately took his place, as if the dance itself required a certain number of participants and would not be denied. More followed. A woman died of a stroke, her brain simply overloading from exhaustion. Another dancer collapsed and never regained consciousness, dying 3 days later without ever waking. A young man danced off the edge of the stage and broke his neck. The death toll climbed. Some estimates suggest 15 deaths per day at the plague's peak, though exact numbers are lost to history. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. The dancers knew. Some of them, in brief moments of lucidity, would beg to be restrained, to be stopped before they died. They would plead with their families to lock them in cellars, to bind their feet, to do whatever was necessary to break the compulsion. And then the compulsion would return, and they would dance away from their wood, be saviors, back into the crowd of writhing bodies, back into the music that never stopped. The families of the afflicted set up vigils at the edges of the dancing grounds. Wives watched their husbands dance. Parents watched their children. They brought water, tried to offer food, begged the musicians to stop playing. But the city council had made its decision. The dancing would continue until the cure was complete. Some families took matters into their own hands. They forcibly removed their loved ones from the dancing grounds, dragging them into houses and barring the doors. These interventions sometimes worked. The dancers, when removed from the music and the crowd, would sometimes collapse into exhausted sleep and wake hours or days later with no memory of what had happened. But others, even when locked away, would continue to dance in their confinement, throwing themselves against walls, screaming in frustration, their bodies refusing to stop the terrible movement. One account, preserved in a letter from a merchant to his brother in Basel, describes a scene that captures the absolute horror of those weeks. He writes of seeing a mother and daughter dancing together not by choice, but because both had been afflicted. The mother was older, weaker, and she collapsed after 3 days. The daughter, still moving in that mechanical rhythm, danced around her mother's body, stepping over it again and again, unable to stop even to mourn. By mid-August, the city of Strasbourg had transformed into something unrecognizable. Normal life had ceased. Markets were empty, workshops were closed, the streets were divided into 2 types, abandoned entirely. The constant music had driven many to the brink of madness. Even those not afflicted reported hearing the drums in their sleep, feeling phantom rhythms in their own feet. The smell of death hung over everything. Bodies were removed from the dancing grounds and taken directly to mass graves outside the city walls. There was no time for individual funerals, no time for prayers or proper burial rites. The city was in a state of emergency, and every resource was devoted to managing the crisis. And still, no one could explain why it was happening. The physicians revised their theories daily. Perhaps it was a poison in the water supply. Perhaps it was tainted grain from the failed harvests. Perhaps it was an ailment of the nerves, transmitted through sight, because there was a pattern to the spread. Those who watched the dancers closely were more likely to become afflicted themselves. Families learned to avert their eyes, to shield their children from the sight of the dancing crowds. The priests, meanwhile, grew more extreme in their interpretations. This was God's wrath. They thundered from pulpits. This was punishment for the city's tolerance of Protestant ideas, for its failure to root out heresy with sufficient violence. Some called for public burnings, for the execution of known reformers, for mass repentance and flagellation. Others suggested the opposite, that the dancing was a sign that the old ways had failed, that the Catholic Church had lost its power to protect the faithful. The city tore itself apart with accusations and counter-accusations, even as the dancers continued their macabre performance. But there was one group that saw something else in the dancing plague. The women, particularly the older women, the midwives and healers who worked in the shadows of official medicine, recognized patterns that the male physicians missed. They noted that the majority of the afflicted were women. They noted that these women tended to be from the poorest districts, the areas where hunger had hit hardest. They noted that many had recently lost children, lost husbands, lost everything they had to the famine and disease. One midwife, whose name has not survived, but whose testimony was recorded by a sympathetic priest, made an observation that would not be taken seriously for another 4 centuries. They are not dancing, she said. They are trying to escape something inside themselves. The turning point came in early September, though it was a turning point born not of understanding, but of exhaustion. The city council, realizing that their strategy had failed catastrophically, reversed course. The music was stopped. The guild halls were closed. The dancers were removed from the streets gently when possible, forcibly when necessary, and taken to churches and monasteries. There, a different treatment was attempted. Instead of encouraging the dance, the priests attempted to break it through religious intervention. The afflicted were taken to the shrine of Saint Vitus in Saverne, about 20 miles from Strasbourg. They were made to pray, to confess their sins, to wear small crosses around their necks and blessed wreaths on their heads. And slowly, impossibly, it began to work. Or perhaps the plague simply ran its course. Perhaps whatever psychological or neurological phenomenon had triggered the compulsion had exhausted itself. Perhaps the human body has limits even when the mind is willing to push beyond them. We'll never know the true mechanism. But by the end of September, the dancing had stopped. The streets of Strasbourg fell silent. The last afflicted dancer, a woman whose name was recorded as Adelheid, stopped moving on the 24th of September, after more than 60 days of continuous dancing. She collapsed into sleep so deep that her family feared she had died. She woke 3 days later with no memory of the previous 2 months. The death toll from the dancing plague of 1518 has never been precisely determined. Contemporary records are fragmentary and contradictory. Some sources suggest as few as 15 deaths. Others claim more than 100. The most credible modern estimates place the number between 40 to 50 people who literally danced themselves to death in the streets of Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, but the true toll was far higher. Those who survived were forever changed. Many were left with permanent injuries, feet that never healed properly, hearts weakened by the extreme exertion, minds scarred by the memory of losing control of their own bodies. Several survivors took their own lives in the months that followed, unable to live with the trauma of what they had experienced. The families of the afflicted bore their own scars. Children who had watched their parents dance grew into adults haunted by the memory. Husbands and wives were torn apart by the guilt of having been unable to help their partners. The merchant whose letter described the mother and daughter reported that the daughter, after recovering, refused to ever speak again. She lived another 40 years in complete silence, unable or unwilling to put words to what she had endured. And Strasbourg itself changed. The city that had been torn apart by religious conflict found a kind of grim unity in the aftermath of the plague. Protestant and Catholic leaders alike agreed that what had happened was a warning, though they could not agree on what it warned against. New churches were built, new saints' shrines were established. The city became, for a time, obsessively religious, as if the citizens believed that sufficient piety could prevent another outbreak. But what actually happened in Strasbourg in 1518? Why did 400 people dance until they dropped? Why could no force of will, no physical restraint, no rational argument stop the compulsion? The theories have evolved over the centuries, but certainty remains elusive. The early medical explanations focused on ergot poisoning, a fungal infection of rye grain that produces compounds similar to LSD. Ergot poisoning can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and involuntary muscle contractions. It was known to medieval physicians as St. Anthony's fire. But there are problems with this theory. Ergot poisoning typically causes painful burning sensations and gangrene, symptoms not reported in the dancing plague. Moreover, ergot effects are neurological and temporary. They don't explain weeks of continuous dancing. Another medical theory suggests a form of epilepsy or neurological disorder triggered by stress, malnutrition, and disease. The repeated famines and sweating sickness epidemics had left the population of Strasbourg in a state of extreme physical vulnerability. Perhaps some combination of factors created a kind of mass seizure disorder, but this, too, fails to explain the specificity of the symptoms. Why dancing, specifically? Why the inability to stop when conscious and aware? Some modern researchers have proposed psychological explanations rooted in mass psychogenic illness, what used to be called mass hysteria. This is a real phenomenon, documented in numerous cases throughout history, where groups of people develop physical symptoms with no organic cause, transmitted through social and psychological mechanisms rather than biological ones. The conditions in Strasbourg were perfect for such an outbreak: extreme stress, religious anxiety, social upheaval, malnutrition, and a cultural context where dancing was associated with both divine ecstasy and demonic possession. In this framework, Frau Trofia's initial dancing, perhaps triggered by personal trauma or mental illness, became a template that others unconsciously copied as a way of expressing their own unbearable psychological distress. The historical record supports this interpretation to a degree. Dancing manias were not unique to Strasbourg. Similar outbreaks occurred throughout the medieval and early modern period, particularly in times of stress and social disruption. In 1374, in Aachen, Germany, people danced in the streets until they collapsed. In 1418, in Strasbourg itself, exactly 100 years before the major outbreak, there was a smaller dancing epidemic. In 1563, in Basel, Switzerland, children were struck by a dancing compulsion. What all these outbreaks had in common was the context. Communities under extreme stress, caught between the old medieval certainties and the new uncertainties of the Reformation era, populations decimated by famine and plague, people desperately searching for meaning in a world that seemed increasingly meaningless. Anthropologist John Waller, who has studied the 1518 outbreak extensively, argues that the dancing was a form of trance state induced by psychological stress and cultural beliefs about curses and saints. In the medieval world, being cursed by Saint Vitus was a real and terrifying possibility. If you believed, truly believed, in the way that only people in that era could believe, that Saint Vitus might curse you with uncontrollable dancing, then the belief itself could create the reality. The mind is capable of extraordinary things when it believes them to be true. This is not mysticism. This is documented neuroscience. Beliefs can create real physical symptoms. Stress can trigger real physiological responses. And in a community where everyone shares the same fears, the same cultural narratives, the same desperate circumstances, those individual responses can synchronize into something that looks very much like contagion. But there's something this explanation doesn't quite capture: the sheer horror of what happened, the brutality of watching your own body betray you, the helplessness of being unable to stop even when every fiber of your being is screaming for rest, the trauma of participating in your own destruction. The accounts from survivors, fragmentary as they are, speak to an experience that transcends simple psychological stress. They speak of something that felt, to them, like possession, like their bodies had been hijacked by something beyond themselves. Whether that something was a saint's curse, a demon, or simply the deepest parts of their own unconscious minds releasing trauma in the only way available, the phenomenological experience was the same: loss of control, loss of self, loss of the fundamental boundary between will and body. And perhaps that's the real horror of the dancing plague. Not that we can't fully explain it, but that we can explain too much of it. Because if a medieval city under stress could fall into collective madness, if hundreds of people could lose control of their own bodies through nothing more than belief and fear and social contagion, what does that say about the stability of our own reality? We like to think we're beyond such things. We have modern medicine, psychiatric care, a scientific understanding of the mind and body. We live in the age of reason, of empiricism, of evidence-based treatment. But scratch the surface, and you find that we're not so different from the citizens of Strasbourg. Mass psychogenic illness still occurs. In 2011, in Leroy, New York, a group of high school students developed Tourette's, like symptoms, sudden tics, verbal outbursts, uncontrollable movements. The conditions spread through social contact and media exposure. In 2012, in El Carmen de Bolivar, Colombia, nearly 300 teenage girls developed a mysterious illness with symptoms including fainting, numbness, and difficulty breathing. No organic cause was ever found. These modern outbreaks don't involve dancing until death, true, but they demonstrate the same fundamental principle. The mind can override the body. Belief can create reality. And when a community is under sufficient stress, individual psychological breaks can cascade into collective phenomena. The dancing plague of 1518 ended, but it never truly stopped. It echoes through history, a reminder that we are never as far from the edge as we think. That civilization is not a solid foundation, but a fragile agreement. That the line between sanity and madness, between individual will and collective compulsion, is thinner than we want to admit. In Strasbourg today, there is little to mark what happened. The medieval streets where Frau Trophia first began dancing have been rebuilt, modernized, transformed into tourist destinations. The guild halls where hundreds danced themselves to death are gone. Even the cathedral, which watched over it all, bears no plaque, no memorial, no acknowledgement of that terrible summer. But the records remain. In archives and libraries across Europe, you can find the accounts, the death certificates. The city council records detailing the hiring of musicians and the construction of dancing stages. The letters from witnesses trying to explain the inexplicable. The medical journals filled with observations of a phenomenon that defied every theory they had. And in those records, if you read carefully, you can find something else, the names. Not all of them, many were never recorded, especially the women, but some survived: Frau Trophia, Klaus Wittmann, Adelheid, each name a person, each person a life interrupted, transformed, or ended by something they never understood. We owe them more than to simply dismiss their experience as medical curiosity or historical oddity. We owe them the acknowledgement that what happened to them was real. Perhaps not literally a curse from Saint Vitus, perhaps not demonic possession, but real nonetheless. Real terror, real suffering, real death, and we owe them the humility to admit that we don't have all the answers. That despite our scientific progress, despite our understanding of psychology and neurology and social dynamics, there remain aspects of the human experience that defy complete explanation. The dancing plague of 1518 is not a puzzle we can solve and file away. It's a question that continues to ask itself. The story of Strasbourg's dancing plague remains a mystery not because of what happened, but because of what it reveals about the fragility of the human mind. 400 people danced, dozens died, and in that collective loss of control, in that mass surrender to compulsion, we see something that should terrify us: the recognition that we are not as in control as we believe ourselves to be. But questions remain, questions that haunt medical historians and neurologists and anthropologists to this day. Why did the city authorities decide to encourage the dancing rather than stop it? Were they truly following medical advice, or was there a darker reason, a desire to let the undesirables, the poor and the desperate, dance themselves to death? What happened to Frau Trophia after the plague ended? The records go silent on her fate. Did she survive? Did she remember what sparked that first step into madness? And perhaps most disturbing, why has this story been largely forgotten? Why isn't the dancing plague of 1518 taught in schools, discussed in medical journals, remembered as one of the most bizarre mass phenomena in European history? Perhaps these questions are meant to remain unanswered. Perhaps the not knowing is itself part of the lesson, a reminder that some aspects of human experience resist neat categorization, resist simple explanation, resist being fully known. To this day, historians who study the dancing plague report a strange phenomenon. After spending months immersed in the accounts, reading the testimonies, imagining the scenes, they find themselves unconsciously tapping their feet, moving to rhythms that aren't there. Most dismiss it as coincidence, as the mind playing tricks. Some know better. They step away from the research, take breaks, remind themselves that they are not in Strasbourg, not in 1518, that they are safe. But late at night, when the house is quiet and the mind starts to wander, some of them still hear it, the relentless pounding of drums, the shriek of pipes, the shuffle of hundreds of feet against cobblestones, the music that never stopped, the dance that consumed a city. And they wonder, if they had been there, in those streets, in that summer of heat and hunger and fear, would they have been strong enough to resist? Or would they, too, have felt their feet begin to move, felt the rhythm take hold, felt themselves surrendering to the compulsion? Would you? If this journey through the streets of medieval Strasbourg has resonated with you, if you find yourself lying awake tonight pondering the terrifying fragility of the boundary between control and compulsion, then this channel has more truths waiting in the shadows. Subscribe if you're willing to confront the uncomfortable questions about human nature that history tries to bury. Leave a like if this account provoked something deeper than entertainment, if it made you question the stability of your own mind, the reliability of your own will. And in the comments, I want to know, if you had been a member of the Strasbourg City Council, facing 400 people dancing in your streets with no explanation and no cure, what would you have done? Would you have hired the musicians? Would you have locked the afflicted away? Or would you have simply fled, leaving the city to its madness? Until next time, remember the most terrifying stories are the ones that force us to see ourselves clearly. And sometimes that revelation is the darkness we're really afraid of. Sometimes, when we look into the abyss of history, we find it dancing to a rhythm we can almost hear ourselves.